在讲座正式开始之前呢，我就先跟大家再介绍一下本场讲座的3位嘉宾。主讲人劳雷尔·彼得森呢是耶鲁英国艺术中心版画与素描部的助理策展人，他的研究呢就聚焦于18世纪的英国艺术，尤其关注素描史。曾经呢策划了约翰辛格、萨金特的木炭肖像、建筑、戏剧与幻想、比别纳家族、朱尔什、费舍收藏的素描展等等展览。目前呢，也正在策划他们馆的新展《格温·约翰奇异之美》，以及特立尼达艺术家米歇尔·让·卡扎邦的展览。另外一位主讲人霍利·谢弗呢，是布朗大学的艺术史与建筑史副教授。目前呢，他的研究聚焦于18至19世纪的英国与南亚艺术。他的著作有嫁接的艺术1760到1910西印度斗争中的艺术创作与占有，这本书呢也先后获得了多项国际的奖项。霍利呢还主编了亚洲艺术的第51卷，这一卷呢就主要聚焦在平面艺术在亚洲与欧洲之间的流动。目前呢，他也正在撰写一本关于实物艺术与艺术品味的一本新的著作。语坛人刘夏宁呢是中央美术学院人文学院的艺术史博士，香港中文大学文物馆的博士后研究员，参与了百贤基金会陈在斋中国漆器研究项目。刘老师的研究呢就聚焦于17至18世纪的跨文化艺术史、物质文化与亚洲漆器，尤其关注中国款的中国彩漆屏风与中国漆器。相信通过3位嘉宾的分享与交流呢，一定能带给我们很多新的启发与思考。接下来呢，我就把话筒交给我们今天的主讲人劳雷尔和霍利。Okay, I will pass the microphone to you, Laura and Holly. Okay.
Thank you so much. And thank you for welcoming us to Paragon Bookstore. We're delighted to be here and to share our exhibition, Painters, Ports, and Prophets, Artists, and the East India Company, 1750 to 1850. And we'll also just show you the cover of the book, especially as this is such a wonderful bookstore. And then we'll move on into telling you a little bit about the Yale Center for British Art, where the exhibition is on view right now.
So we are coming to you from New Haven, Connecticut, just about 2 hours on the train from New York City. And this is the museum where the exhibition is being shown right now, the Yale Center for British Art, which was the building was designed by the architect Louis Kahn. And so you're seeing it from the outside and the inside. The collection is the museum's about 50 years old, and it was the gift of a Yale College alumnus, Paul Mellon, who was the class of 1929, who came from the Mellon family with a long a banking dynasty that was also very interested in art. And he was a passionate collector of British art and collected a lot in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and gave his collection to Yale University, along with the building and an endowment to continue to ensure that it could continue to move forward. So this is the collection that most of the works in the show and in the book are coming out of. For many people familiar with our museum, William Blake, Constable, and I'm showing you just 3 of our sort of prized works in the collection. But the collection itself, which has, in terms of prints, and it has around 100,000 objects in total. And what we wanted to do when beginning this exhibition was to think about how the representation of works from Asia, particularly from India and China. And over the course of our research, which took about 4 years, we were able to identify more than 2,000 works in the collection that come from this very rich period. And so this is the kind of context that gave birth to the exhibition.
And just this is a virtual walkthrough, essentially. And so we're entering into the exhibition now. This is kind of the first introductory space. And this is also where we'll kind of introduce the concepts of the show. So this exhibition tells the story of artists from India, Britain, and China who worked under one of the most powerful corporations in history. The British East India Company began in 1600 as a private trading enterprise, but it grew into a military and political force during the 18th and 19th centuries. It waged war to rule large parts of India and to sell opium in China. To advance its pursuit of profit, the company encouraged its agents to commission art as a tool of commerce and empire. And just to that the company, the court of directors in London, they actually did not commission that much art. And so we want to clarify this at the beginning. Rather, they outsourced it as good business people tend to do. They outsourced the labor of commissioning, patronizing art to company agents who then commissioned art. And if they wanted to, they could send a copy back to the East India Company headquarters in London. This also meant that artists had a lot of agency. They were able to create works on speculation for a company-oriented market or a potential company audience. And these works of art could represent commodities. They could function as gifts to ease trade deals and to forge military and political alliances. Or these works could visually record information about the places and societies where the company traded and governed. Now, the artists featured here came from many backgrounds. Some trained in art schools in Britain, as well as in military institutes. Others were trained in Indian courts, others in Chinese workshops. In their artistic exchanges, these artists from very different regions and skill sets combined regional methods with new materials and techniques. They interacted in cities where the company sought and claimed power. And this exhibition, which is again, as Laurel was saying, is drawn from the Yale Center for British Art's rich collection of works from Asia. It takes us on a journey through port cities. It shows how artists shaped and were shaped by the company's ruthless ventures while creating artworks of great beauty and innovation.
So the works that we're going to be talking about today were produced in this crucial 100-year period in the history in South Asia and East Asia, and they were made along the trade routes of the British East India Company. The East India Company had been founded in 1600 and held a monopoly on British with Asia. But within this 700-year period, the business really transformed itself from the trading enterprise to the military and political force. And it's worth noting that by the early 19th century, the company's army was the largest in the world. It was twice the size of the British military, and largely based in India during this period. And so the works that you see here just give you a little bit of a taste of the kinds of works that we'll be discussing. And I'm also going to show you a map just to give you a sense of the geography that the exhibition discusses. This is a map that we're using in the exhibition where the key cities are marked, which are cities that where we have particular strength in the YCBA collections, but are also cities where the company had or was seeking power during the period. And so we'll be going on a journey through these cities, sort of beginning in Calcutta and Patna, moving up to Lucknow and Faizabad, and then looping around to Bombay and Pune before moving to Canton and Macau. And the map is also showing you the land that is controlled by the British East India Company. By 1765, the company held all of the land that was that's marked in the light yellow. They were the tax collectors, the governors, and the military powers. By by 1857, their power had expanded to encompass everything that you see in yellow. So it's in these areas where where they have this strength. Of course, in Canton and Macau, they're one of many traders during this period, seeking particularly tea and trading in tea, but they don't have the same kind of governing force that they do in India.
And just to point out that one of the main reasons they were, it was because they were able to take over these regions, including this area around Patna, which is one of the main areas where poppies were cultivated and then processed into opium, which the East India Company expanded tremendously, that the connection between the traded opium for tea produced in China was able to occur. And so it is really important that colonial control of India directly impacted the trade in China. We wanted to start with this watercolor. It's about this large. I hope everyone can see. And in a way, it kind of projects the fantasy of the British East India Company power in India. And it's titled Traveling Palanquins. And you can see that an East India Company officer, he's wearing the red coat, which identifies him as part of the military, is lying down in a palanquin being carried by 4 Indian men. And they're following other men who are employed by the company, who are carrying torches as well as water sprinklers in order to kind of tamp down the earth. And then in front of them, they're led by East India Company soldiers who were known as sepoys from the Persian 4-foot soldier in the period. Here they're traveling likely in the early morning. We see the dawn, that those first sun rays on the horizon in that cool of the morning. And behind them, you can see their luggage being carried, as well as another palanquin with the Indian mistress, essentially, or BB, of the East India Company officer in the central mode of transportation. This type of image, again, is giving you this sense of how the company is moving on the roads, on the waterways. You can see the river in the background across territories in India in pursuit of profit. What might initially be less apparent from the composition and the subject of the image is the ingenuity of the artists who made this. They are essentially creating a design for the work that can be replicated in order to appeal to many potential company patrons. The man in the central palanquin is not a specific portrait. He's a generalized officer with the idea, and sometimes you see a very similar type of image where the man's face is actually obscured, again, with the idea that anyone, any company officer could, in their imagination, step into this person's position. So we can learn a lot from an image like this about how artists were creating works for the East India Company, creating designs that they could repeat for numerous buyers and that would appeal to a company market and be part of their own business. We can also learn a lot from doing technical analysis. And this was another, a large part of our work in the exhibition, was to work very closely with papers and paintings conservators at the Yale Center for British Art, as well as with conservation scientists at Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. And here I'm showing you on the left an X-ray which reveals the watermark of the paper of of this work, and we've kind of pulled out that watermark in yellow. It's not actually yellow in the paper. That's just to help us see that X-ray. And it's telling us that this is British-made paper. And then on the right, we're showing you the UV image, which is showing us the fluorescence of a very special pigment, which is known as Indian yellow. Now, Indian yellow was a pigment that was really made in India in this period. So from a historical perspective and a conservation perspective, it allows us to locate where the pigment was made, in this case, India. And it also has this quality of luminescence. Now, what is Indian yellow? Indian yellow is a pigment made from the urine of cows fed exclusively on mango leaves. And it indeed has that brilliant yellow mango-hued color that artists loved for its brilliance, right? And that also its permanence. Yellows are often ephemeral pigments, especially if they're made from flowers or flowers primarily. And so Indian yellow had this ability to kind of be very bright and very stable as a pigment. From a conservation perspective, it's also very wonderful because you can identify it only through UV light. And what this means is you can essentially just take a special flashlight and wave it over a sheet of paper and identify whether Indian yellow has been used. And it's a way to see how pigments and papers were circulating on local as well as company markets. And in this case, we can see that that British-made paper, that Indian yellow, Indian-made pigment, these artists are using both, right? So they're using both British materials as well as techniques, as well as Indian materials and techniques.
And so with the kind of the stories that we began to unpack with these tools of conservation and conservation science, we wanted to start asking questions, sort of probing what we could know about a work of art, even if we didn't know the artist's name. And so I'm showing you the first work that most visitors will encounter in the show, which is this really striking watercolor of a bird perched on a flowering branch. And it's painted on British-made paper. And so we knew that from the outset. We also knew that when this work initially came to the Yale Center for British Art, it was thought to be the work of George Edwards, who was a British ornithologist. Sometime in the 1990s, someone realized this was a work probably made in India. But we wondered, can we know that for sure in any way? We also noted the bird and flower together reminded us of some bird and flower paintings from the Chinese tradition. And so we thought, well, what is it that we can know about this work? So as Holly was describing with the previous drawing, we began by shining a UV light over the work. And so this is in our conservation lab. And the moment that we saw the yellow fluorescing, which was a really exciting moment because this bird known as a yellow-eyed babbler has this bright yellow around the eye, indicating that Indian yellow was used. But what surprised us was that it wasn't just the eye, but it was also the leaves that were fluorescing. And you can see in the image on the right how they're kind of lighting up, whereas the reds are quite dull. And so we realized that not only was the pigment being used on its own, but it was also being used as a part of a mixture. And so that prompted us to ask, well, what's the blue that's mixing with this incredible yellow pigment? So the conservation scientists, who are all organic chemists, brought their amazing analysis tools, which they could do which are basically imaging. And what you're looking at here is a set of 3 element maps created by X-ray fluorescence. This is a technique that maps the chemical signals given off by a work of art in this case. And so you're seeing mercury on the left, iron at the center, and lead in the right. So we see these different chemical signals. The brighter the signal, the brighter it appears on the map, the stronger the pigment. And the iron was particularly exciting to us because it indicates that the artist is using Prussian blue, which was a pigment that was first synthesized in Europe in the early 18th century, and then was exported around the globe. So that showed us that we have a European pigment and an Indian pigment making these rich greens. The red from the mercury, we were able to identify as vermilion, which was almost certainly sourced in China. So here we have this sort of sense of the global market in pigments being brought together on one page. The inscription identifying the bird uses the Persian name, sort of misidentifies the bird, but uses a Persian name, indicating that the work indeed probably was made in India, but is very much part of this global network, and probably produced for East India Company agents who were interested in learning about the bird species, the plant species, and the world that they were encountering. They were interested in finding new commodities, but there's also, and you'll see this in many works in the show, a real sense of wonder that comes out of looking at plants and animals in particular that they had that were new for the artists for the patrons who were buying these works of art.
And from this kind of discussion of the global movement of pigments and papers, and also the discovery kind of plants and animals, we move into the routes that company agents took to move those commodities and ideas around the world. And so the first part of the exhibition focuses on ports, the port cities, either on oceans, on rivers, where the East India Company traded. And here we're just showing you 2 images. On the right, William Daniel's quite large-scale painting of the European factories at Canton. And on the left, the Taj Mahal from the river in Agra in India, where you can see the boats carrying goods and people on those on right past that kind of amazing monument. And what we see in the discussion of port cities is, again, what are the artists trying to tell us about these places? In the case of the Taj Mahal, they want to share the details of this magnificent monument, but also its connection to the river and to cultivation and to gardens. On the right, this painting is telling viewers in London, it was exhibited at the Royal Academy, about one of the most important places where the British East India Company traded goods in the 18th and 19th century. And you can see from the image that it's almost as if this is an invitation to trade, right? The Pearl River is shown as very placid. All of the boats are easily moving in and out of the port. The flags of the different European factories are waving in the breeze, and everything seems at ease and calm. Now, this is an important vision, right? It's an idyllic vision that is important for the owner of this painting, who happened to be the director of the East India Company docks in London. So this in London, these docks, which had just recently been built, they're essentially the other side of the trade with Canton, right? So the owner of this work was essentially telling investors in London, this is where your goods are going and they're safe. They're going to be smoothly unpacked, smoothly repacked, and you're going to, triple, quadruple, whatever it is, you're going to make a profit. So this is, in a way, we can tell so much about how art is working on the viewer from works like these.
And alongside this idyllic vision of trade, we also see artists who are interested in painting commodities. And one of the really striking works in the exhibition and the book is this stunning image of a bread nut. This work was painted almost certainly by artists who were trained in China, but working in the Malacca Straits, so in present-day Malaysia. And one of the reasons that we know that is because the inscription in the lower right-hand corner uses the word sukun, which is the Malay word for breadfruit, as this particular species was identified in the 19th century. The breadfruit, the more famous relative of the bread nut, fascinated Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries because it's a starch that grows very easily with very little care. The trees grow fast, they produce a lot of fruit, and the fruit is very nutritious. So that's how it came to have this name, breadfruit, kind of a natural bread. For the Royal Society in London, which is the preeminent scientific society in this period, those in the Royal Society were interested in the breadfruit as a kind of food solution. One of the first sort of trials, experiments that they did was they transplanted these trees from Tahiti, where they're native, to the Caribbean. And the idea was that the breadfruit could serve as a food for enslaved workers in the Caribbean, and with the idea that then more of the labor could be devoted to sugar cultivation and less to food cultivation. This didn't take off. One form of resistance was not eating this breadfruit, although the breadfruit now today is a staple food crop in many islands of the Caribbean. In India, where famines had devastated populations, particularly in Bengal, with millions of people dying, there was an attempt to bring the breadfruit as a food source to India as well. Again, it didn't take off, but we get a sense of this fruit being entangled in these imperial networks. And the painting itself is actually linked to these imperial networks. We took an X-ray, so you're seeing in the upper right-hand corner an X-ray of the work upside down, again with the watermark highlighted. In European paper, often, which is produced on a screen, often the paper makers would include their name in this screen in order to kind of brand the paper so that people could identify it, identify the quality, the weight of the paper, and also the date. What we were really excited to see was not only the name of Whatman, J. Whatman, who's the preeminent paper maker in Britain during this period, but also on the right-hand side, the mark of the British East India Company. So UEIC, the United East India Company. So we know that actually this paper was made specifically for the company market. And that actually this is one of, as I was researching this work, I found one that looked almost identical to it, and then another. And I've been able to find 6 different versions of this painting of a breadfruit, probably produced in workshops intended for Europeans who were interested in the fruit.
From thinking about these kind of global movements of commodities like and food solutions like the breadfruit through ports. In the book and in the exhibition, we then move into specific port cities where the British East India Company held territorial control. So in Calcutta, Patna, and Madras. And just to state that we're using the historical names, the English historical names for these cities. Part of what guided us to these cities was the strengths in the collections, but also the artist networks that we could identify. We were especially interested in how artists were working across different skill sets, different techniques, as well as different regions. Here we're looking at two works by Jairam Das, who was part of a group of artists in Patna who kind of worked in multiple fashions, who were drawing from Mughal techniques, they were drawing from British techniques in order to appeal to a company market. And here we're looking at two works that would have been part of a series of watercolors connected to castes and occupations. So how are people working and kind of what categories of society were they understood to be in the period? Here we also see a hierarchy. The central figure in each work was understood to be kind of a more elevated class. On the left, we're looking at a steward of the household, and behind him, the man who is bearing the day's vegetables as well as two fowl for the day's meals. On the right, we're looking at two water carriers. Again, the woman at the center in front in the foreground is wearing more elaborate dress. She's wearing a more elaborate sari as well as jewels, whereas the woman in the background is dressed more plainly. And these hierarchies ended up participating in how the company would classify and identify people. And these types of works were often used to understand on the part of the company that who was going to work in their households, but it eventually led into state surveillance. In this case, we're also seeing, in the case of Jairam Das, that he worked with and for the opium agent of this region, Charles Doyley, who was an avid amateur artist alongside his wife, Eliza Jane Doyley. And they formed a society in order of artists to, and I quote, cultivate art in the East. And as part of that project, Charles Doyley imported a lithographic press, and Eliza, Jairam Das, and his brother Shiva Dayal all worked together kind of quite playfully, looking at each other's works, printing them on the press, and then placing them next to each other. And in this case, you see on the left, work by Eliza Jane Doyley, and on the right, a work first drawn by Shiva Dayal, and then drawn on that lithographic stone by Eliza Doyley. So we see artists working on exactly the same image. If you can see, it actually looks quite similar as well to Jairam Das's portrayal of the woman on the right. And so we can get a sense not only for the hierarchies that were existing within this society, but also the potential relationships and camaraderie and learning that occurred among artists. And this one other point to make is that these are artists who are working in the popular market. Jairam Das, Shiva Dayal worked for specific patrons, but they also sold their work from boats on the river they would move to different homes in the cantonments in order to sell their work. So they're making their work on speculation as part of a popular market, which contrasts with other works that were produced by the company for specific patrons.
And one of those patrons was Lady Mary Impey, and you're seeing her seated at the center. Lady Mary Impey came to Calcutta in the late 1770s with her husband, Elijah Impey, who was one of the first Supreme Court judges for the company. So when the company moves to Calcutta and establishes Calcutta as a seat of power, it also establishes its own administrative systems, including a court system. When Lady Mary Impey arrives in Calcutta, she's 25 years old. She has left her 5 children back in England, and she becomes very interested in the natural world around her and begins commissioning works of art by 3 artists. Sheikh Zain al-Din, who is the artist you see who painted this scene in her household, Bhavani Das and Ram Das. These 3 artists who who were working in Patna, where the doilies were later, and had moved to Calcutta seeking the kind of patronage that the Impeys provided. And one of the really extraordinary works in the exhibition is this image of a great Indian fruit bat or a flying fox. This is a bat that would have been flying around Calcutta. The Impeys also had a menagerie where they kept birds. Many of those birds were represented by the artists working for the Impeys. And by the time they left India, they had commissioned more than 300 sheets depicting the birds, mammals, and plants that they were seeing. With this work of art, we see not only an extraordinary representation of this mammal, but we also see an artist who is exploring new materials and techniques, being both challenged and inspired by them. Bhavani Das would have trained in a Mughal style of painting. And so he would have trained using a kind of paper called Vasli paper, which is made by burnishing thin sheets of paper together to create a very smooth and almost card-like surface. Because of the surface of Vasli paper, the smoothness as well as its slight variation, he would have been using very opaque, very dry watercolors to apply onto the surface of the paper, which he would then burnish again to make them smooth and to give the colors give them a kind of jewel-like tone. This is done by either crushing the pigments into the surface and then allowing them to rest on the top. Lady Mary Impey presumably gave paper or provided the paper for the artists who are working for her in order to create these images, and she was giving them or providing them with European sheets of paper made almost certainly in Britain. British paper was being produced on a much larger scale than Vasli paper typically was. And so it gave artists the opportunity, as one of the authors in the catalog says, to think big and to draw big. And for this bat has a wingspan of more than 5 feet. So the opportunity to have a large sheet was great for getting the bat as close to life size as possible. And the sheet itself is about yay big. To make this image, Bhavani Das is using techniques used on that Vasli shade of paper, using a brush made of just a few squirrel hairs to render these minute details. You can just see the fur on this fuzzy body and the wonderful whiskers that are sprouting from the bat's nose. But he also took advantage of the absorbency of British paper, which responds to pigment in a slightly different way. And if we go back to look at the wings, you can see how you get a sense of of a bit of the translucency as the pigment, the watercolor pigment sinks into the paper, giving you the sense of what it looks like when light shines behind a bat's wing. So he's working together with these two techniques to create an extraordinary work of art. And through the work that we did with conservation scientists, we were also able to see that he was using lead white around the edges of the image. This is a technique that's frequently seen in Indian art, where artists are using white as a kind of whiteout in order to correct mistakes, or in this case, really to crisp up the edges of the bat's wings. So you get this incredibly strong, crisp line from the lead white.
From these stories of artists working together in Calcutta and Patna, we then move into the further north up the Ganges River to some of its tributaries, like the Gomti River in Faizabad and Lucknow in the region of Awadh in northern India. And one of the real kind of standout moments of the exhibition is connected to the Lucknow scroll, which you're seeing on the screen, actually in the paper conservation studio at the Yale Center for British Art. And this is a 37-foot long scroll, which shows the city of Lucknow from on the banks of the river Gomti. And here's the installation shot in the exhibition. And we were able, the installation team was actually able to build a case to hold one half of the scroll unrolled for the first half, and now we've just rolled up the first half and unrolled the second half for the second half of the exhibition. In terms of this was also another one of the objects that we focused on a lot in terms of conservation, because there are some mysteries around this work of art, such as who commissioned it, who was it intended for. We know from this work with conservators that it is made up of 36 sheets of paper. And here's just a few of those. And you can see the seams. Let's see if I can do this. You can see where those sheets are kind of brought together. And those, initially, those were distributed among different artists. And you can sometimes, actually this one, you can see how two different artists have worked on the scroll. So that's kind of where we can see those multiple hands. And then they were brought together after the city was painted, backed on a cotton backing, and then an artist painted in the sky and painted in the river. Now, what also was very interesting, what we learned from conservation, was that artists used different techniques, similar to what we were seeing with the bat, where Bhavani Das was both using Mughal techniques of painting for very detailed work, and then for those bat wings using some British watercolor techniques. Here in the sky is laid in with those transparent washes of color, very familiar from British watercolor technique, and the river is painted in with opaque watercolor techniques familiar from Mughal traditions. So what we're seeing is the kind of bringing together of different traditions of art making in honor of this city. From the scroll, we see kind of the magnificence of the architecture. So here we're looking at palaces. We're also seeing mosques. In this case, we're also looking at, this is a gazebo surrounded by neoclassical sculptures, where that was built by the ruler of the period, whose name was Ghazi al-Din Haidar. And these mosques were actually built by famed entertainers of the city, female entertainers who were dancers, singers, and courtesans. And so we can really get a sense for the power of women in the period, that they were able to patronize such kind of monumental architecture. Here, we're also seeing kind of palaces, but alongside these kind of more elite structures, we're also seeing the steps leading down to the river where people and elephants are bathing. We also see people doing laundry in the river. This is where the launderers are washing the clothes and laying them out to dry. Here again, we have some more elephants. And we also see kind of the more of the life of the river. Here we're looking at stacks of thatching grass that were used as roofs for vernacular architecture, as well as for animal feed. And again, with the boats on the river, you see logs being transported. And where we'll get to, we also see kind of boats really made more for entertainment, like this kind of amazing fish boat. And then we also see additional palaces. This wonderful pink palace, which graces the cover of the catalog, was where the king's wives resided. So again, a nod to that female power. And here we see another wonderful palace built by Claude Martin, who was kind of a French entrepreneur who worked both for the rulers of the city, as well as at different periods, both the British and the French East India companies. And he was really an inventor, and you can see that from this palace, which actually guided the river through the lower floor to serve as an older form of air conditioning in the hot months of the year. So from this scroll, we really get a sense for the life of the city, the everyday life, the ecology, and how the city was attuned to the river. Now, again, what you can see in terms of how we started to think about who this might have been made for, there are Persian inscriptions at the base of the scroll written in white. Persian was the language of northern India, used by the administration, by the Mughals, and then also by the British in the initial part, the British East India Company, in the initial part of their rule. And from the Persian inscriptions, we really get a sense for the initial patronage of the scroll. It pays attention to that ruler of the period, Ghazi al-Din Haidar, who in this period had formally separated from the Mughal Empire and crowned himself king of this region. So it's a very significant moment. And those Persian inscriptions also call out female patronage of architecture, as I've mentioned, such as this beautiful pink palace and the mosques I mentioned earlier. What this is telling us is that in the beginning, perhaps this scroll was commissioned by powerful women of the court in honor of the newly crowned king. However, we know by 1826 that the scroll was in the hands of a company agent because of an English translation of these Persian inscriptions. And we also know from conservation that the watermark of the paper is 1819, which means it was likely made in those early 1820 period, in the early 1820s. And that some of the sheets are very finely finished, and others were kind of rushed to the end. And so what this is telling us is that this was likely made for the court of the period, but then perhaps given to a company agent by 1826 as a diplomatic gift. But again, more research needs to be done, and it is being done by graduate students currently.
Within the courts of Avad, we look at the kinds of artistic exchange between artists who are trained in Britain and artists who are trained in India. And we are also thinking about scale as well as material. And so one of our sort of favorite pairings in the exhibition, which we also explore in the catalog, is of these portraits of Shuja al-Dawla, who was the Nawab or governor of the region. And on the left, you're seeing a very large oil painting that was painted by Tilly Kettle. Tilly Kettle was the first professionally trained artist in Britain, a portrait artist, to travel to India. And he painted more than 5 paintings of Shuja. Shuja had invited him to his court, intrigued by European styles of portraiture. The arts in the courts of Avad were very strong. And so Tilly Kettle wasn't working alone. He was working alongside other artists, one of whom was Mir Chand. And Mir Chand was commissioned to make copies after Tilly Kettle's portrait. And so you're seeing on the right an album page from the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, where we see him copying one of the versions of the portraits of Shuja, but positioning him alongside 2 beautiful women and within these foliate borders. And that, again, with this high level of detail and these burnished watercolors and rich golds. When Shuja had the opportunity to choose between portraits, the anecdote is that he much preferred the work of Mir Chand to the large-scale oil portraits, and he was very happy for the oil portraits to go back to Europe, where they were used as diplomatic gifts.
From the port cities and their river cities of Lucknow and Faizabad, in the catalog and in the exhibition, we then move to Western India, to Pune and the Deccan. And the British East India Company, again, here is seeking power. The reason they send their agents to Pune is in order to negotiate an alliance against their common enemy to the south, whose name was Tipu Sultan of Mysore. And Tipu Sultan controlled this very lucrative coastal trade. And so the East India Company was trying to ally with the Western Indian rulers who were known as the Marathas. And who we're seeing on the screen is a very special artist whose work is in the Yale Center for British Arts collection. His name is Gangaram Chintaman Tambat, and he was a local artist in Pune who started to work for the British East India Company ambassador to that Maratha court. And the archive at the Yale Center for British Art includes over 80 of his works. And it's an amazing opportunity to see how a popular artist is working in the period. And we also are able to learn a lot about who Gangaram was as an artist and as a person and how he presented himself. On the right, we're looking at a self-portrait that Gangaram made, again, of himself. And he chose to portray himself in a traditional style of portraiture as an artist in the Mughal and the Rajput tradition. And again, it's a sketch. He's seated on the ground with one knee up with a drawing board on his knee, drawing, face in profile, which within the Mughal and Rajput traditions was the way that you could best identify a person's face. And that's why we see so many profile views in those traditions of working. But Gangaram also portrayed himself in other ways. On the left, we're looking at a watercolor that includes a workshop scene, right? We're looking at 4 Indian artists with one man who we believe to be Gangaram is seated on a chair at a drawing table using a type of optical viewing device. And here I'm just going to point that out with the cursor to draw these far temples on the hill, which belong to the which were used by the Marathas, by the Western Indian rulers of this region. And so here, Gangaram is showing a different style of working, right? He's showing a workshop method where 4 artists are working together. And he's also showing that use of optical devices. And this either was a camera obscura, which projects the kind of outline of a far building onto a drawing sheet, or it could have been a viewing frame, which aids in gridding a far work again onto a sheet. But here we're seeing how Gangaram chose to portray himself in 2 different modes, essentially an Indian method of depiction and a European one, and that he was immensely skilled in both traditions. We also see in his work how he, again, used European techniques, but also molded them to his own vision and understanding of space, in this case, architectural space. This is a monumental facade of a Buddhist temple known as and this is known as a Chaitya Hall at Karla. It's an ancient site from the 1st century of the Common Era, and it's literally carved out of the basalt rock of the region. So we call it architecture because you can enter it, but in a way, it is more like a monumental sculpture. And Gangaram, for this work, wanted to really give the viewer a sense of space. And he joined 6 separate sheets of British-made paper together in order to create, again, the kind of the surface on which he felt he could express that monumentality. He also, and I hope you can see this, as part of those joinings, he also created wings, essentially, on the side. And you can also see that they're toned a slightly darker shade of gray, both on the right and on the left. And we believe that he intended for them to be folded forward as a diorama. And as you would experience the site, the carved elephants at the site are on either side as you walk into the space, into the Chaitya Hall. And again, with this intention of giving you that sense of space. Gangaram was involved in this project with other artists, Scottish artists, as well as an artist named Josie from Goa, with the intention of depicting the rock-carved architecture of the region for Europeans and an Indian audience who were interested in antiquities. And this, alongside kind of scientific exploration, was of great interest to people across the world, thinking about how antiquities of different regions might compare. And here we're looking at those ancient Buddhist sites.
So from Pune, we move now to China. And we were really interested throughout this exhibition in exploring some of the connections between India and China, because these 2 regions were so linked closely with the trade in commodities, particularly tea and opium. And so the next section of the book, as well as the exhibition, focuses on these 2 commodities. The British were obsessed with tea. From in the beginning of the 18th century, it was a very elite and expensive beverage. But by the early 19th century, people across classes in Britain were consuming tea at a great rate. The company all of this tea is coming out of China, traded by the East India Company. And that trade was tightly controlled by the Qing dynasty. The company was required to pay silver in order to purchase tea. And this begins to create a significant trade deficit for the British. And so they begin to explore other ways of trying to balance that trade, which they did in a devastating way by beginning to smuggle opium that they had grown in India, in that region in Patna, as well as in Bombay, and smuggling that opium into China, addicting millions of people. So that's the sort of the larger picture that introduces the sort of larger context that introduces this section. But the painting that really commands this section in the exhibition is this painting of tea production that was painted by William Daniel, the same artist who painted that view in Canton that we saw at the beginning. This painting was made by Daniel in Britain 15 years after he had returned from China. He had visited China twice, both en route to India and going back to Britain. And while he was there, he made many, many sketches of boats, of people, of landscapes, but he probably never saw anything close to what he's representing here. But he paints this painting in order to give the British a sense of tea cultivation in China. And the painting, which was exhibited at the Royal Academy, so this is the preeminent space for displaying contemporary works of art. He displays it at the Academy, and in the exhibition catalog, which every visitor got, it details every single step of tea production that you could see in the painting. And so if you zoom into the details, we can see people planting, cultivating, growing the tea. Then as you move down the river, we see leaves being crisped here, and the tea being loaded onto a boat to be taken down to Canton to be sold. Now, Westerners were not allowed in this region during the period when tea was grown and processed. So Daniel could have never seen any of these details, and it's very unlikely even that he that he may have even seen the landscape itself, because Western presence in this region was so tightly controlled. Really, Westerners could only be present in Canton and Macau, so only a very small number of miles within this vast region. So how did Daniel make this painting? Well, he probably was using sources made by Chinese artists who were producing works for the export market, for Europeans who were interested. And one possibility is that he was looking at sheets such as these. These are two sheets from an album on pith paper called the story. We call it The Story of Tea, which shows 12 steps of the tea cultivation. And you'll note in this, I don't have a detail of it, but this scale that you see here is almost precisely represented in Daniel's painting. But what seems even more likely is that he would have seen an oil painting such as this one that you see on the right. This painting is now in the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts in the United States. There's also a very similar version in Denmark. The thing that's really striking about these paintings is that they're almost exactly the same size. And we see William Daniel using many of the elements from this painting on the right and transforming them into the painting on the left. And he makes some changes following kind of the ideal of landscape painting as sort of used in Britain, which is known as the picturesque, which often has a winding river at the center of the composition, and which fades into a hazy background with the mountains. So it seems like he's taken these elements and recomposed them, but very much drawing on the expertise of artists making paintings in China.
And one other quality of that you see in the tea painting that you also see in images produced about opium is this interest in manufacture. And this is another one of these focuses that we see on the part of artists who are working for the East India Company. What brings them together into kind of a shared visual language, that they're drawing commodities. They're also drawing how those commodities were processed. here we're looking at the production of opium in Patna, right? So in the same way that there's this interest in tea in China, there's also a deep interest in how opium was produced in India. Although this visualization of opium production really only occurs after the Opium Wars. And if you can see, these are lithographs in a book. A lithograph is a type of print process where you can draw on the stone in a very oily crayon. Printmakers really like it because you can draw text and image on the same page. And you can also produce many, many, many copies. The stone can withhold, can be used many times through the printing press. And so, and this was made in 1851, so after the Opium Wars. And this is quite interesting to us because as we were working on this exhibition, we were actually very surprised that this very important but very illegal commodity was almost never pictured. And so here we're really showing you late images of it, but they share this, the way they're composed are part of a kind of industrial aesthetic that was very popular in London at the time. And here you can see an image of the inside of the factory at Patna. And you can see that this artist, who was a company agent, Walter Sherwell, that he's giving you this sense of this everlasting type of factory, right? It has a huge scale. It seems very airy and well ventilated. And there's just this endless production. And here you're seeing each one of these small round balls. They're actually ceramic, would have contained the opium wrapped in poppy petals for transport. In Sherwell's images, the figures are quite small, whereas in an Indian artist who was making works in a similar period, Shivalal, who's again connected to the artists we spoke about earlier, Jairam Das. He's kind of a descendant of those artists. Here he is showing the opium factory at a much smaller scale, which is more honest to the actual art, because the architecture is still extant in India. And he highlights the laborers, right? So his real focus is the people who are making the opium and packaging it. And here you see those same vessels for the opium versus the kind of expanse of the room. So we're really getting a sense for how different artists are showing these spaces and highlighting different aspects. On the left, the emphasis is on the manufacturing process. On the right, it's on the labor of production.
One of the watercolors that we have in the exhibition represents one of the first shots that was fired in the Opium Wars. This is a period, 1839, when tensions over illegal opium sales in China had been growing for months. The devastating rates of addiction among Chinese people prompted Lin Zexu, a Qing dynasty official, to orchestrate the more than 2.5 million pounds of opium being thrown into the sea. Tensions continued to build between the Qing dynasty and the British, who ignored many compelling pleas to cease the trade in opium, eventually erupting in the first of two opium wars. And British victory ended up forcing China to legalize this drug trade in some ways that continued to cause widespread suffering, and also opened up further ports for trade. So we wanted to make sure to highlight this important moment in history, although we do not have many representations of it. However, the work that you're seeing here on the screen was painted by this man here, Joseph Rundle, who was in command of this boat, firing. So he's sort of reporting on the battle that he has been a part of.
In the from this kind of exploration of the economics that undergird the connections between India and China in this period, by way of the East India Company, we then really focus on artistic production in two main cities in China, in Canton and Macau. And here we're really focused on two artists, George Chinnery, who's a very profitable studio was based in Macau, and Chinnery had in fact come from, he's British, but he initially established a studio in Calcutta, and then running away from his wife and his debts, he then moved to Dhaka in what is now Bangladesh. And then further fleeing, he then moved to Macau. And then we also look at the studio and the work of Lam Qua, who had established one of the most important and again very profitable studios in Canton. And we discuss their relationships as well as the people who they were portraying, with an attention especially to the interactions between Chinese businessmen and British and other Western businessmen and doctors.
And so we have this a wonderful self-portrait of Chinnery, just to kind of further reinforce that link between India and China. But then in the book, we were able to explore this, to think about the way in which Chinnery and Lam Qua are working within a very particular aesthetic that appealed to British as well as other Western European markets. And you see here a portrait of William Jardine, one of the a British trader in opium, and also Mau Qua, one of the sort of chief traders who worked with Western traders. And you see, and the portrait by Mau Qua is painted by Lam Chinnery as a model and emulating that. And both of these artists are working within a fashion in European portraiture during this time, which emphasized really bold colors, bravura, brushstrokes, these extraordinary, like this red curtain that billows down behind Jardine. And in both paintings, you can see the way in which they're appealing to this fashion, and how Lam Qua is using very similar elements of this column behind, the elements of business, the ship going off into the distance, to create portraiture that is very much in dialogue. And these two artists really commanding the portrait market in Canton and Macau at the time. And for Westerners, they had a lot of time on their hands. They couldn't travel very far, and they also had a lot of money. And so art was one way that they could spend both of those.
And here in this, and we borrowed the Mau Qua painting and this wonderful watercolor from the Peabody Essex Museum. And here we can kind of get a glimpse of Tinqua's studio. This is one of many watercolors of a painter's studio in Canton. This is Tinqua, who's understood to be Lam Qua's brother. Sometimes this painting actually has Lam Qua on the top, as well as sometimes it has Chinese phrases. What this wonderful watercolor allows us to do and invites us to do is to enter into the second floor of an artist's studio in Canton. And you can see that the windows are open, inviting us through the veranda, past the potted plants, into the studio, where we can see three artists hard at work. And they're likely looking up at a model, and then down at the work that they're making at the period. And the types of works that they're producing are then on display on the walls. And those include portraits. Oh, here. Oh, here. Okay, sorry. I can't actually see. I'm not sure if it.
There you go.
Okay. These include landscape scenes, and again, those serial scenes of manufacture. They include portraits. They also include poetry, ink painting, and again, poetic verses. They also include lanterns, as well as portraits of beauties. And here you're also seeing mirrors as well as different accoutrements, and such as porcelain vases and other beautiful types of objects. And if we actually go back to our previous page, you can see in Lamqua's portrait of Malqua that some of those types of items, like the hanging lamp and the precious objects and ceramics, are on display. And one can imagine a person sitting for their portrait in the studio. And from records, we know that on the third floor of Lamqua and Tinqua's studios, there was a space in order to have to sit for one's portrait. And then on the base floor, again, a space to shop. And so we really do, this is a fantastical image in some respects. We know that Lamqua's studio at least moved multiple times over the course of his career, his physical studio. But this is kind of an ideal studio, a type of invitation on the part of potential buyers to enter into this space. We also see the types of works that could have been made in those studios. Akin to the portrait of Malqua, we also see an image of a beauty, likely a courtesan. And we're seeing her, this is a circle of, we don't know if this is by Lamqua, or likely it's by the Circle of Lamqua or Workshop of Lamqua. But we can see this kind of, the composition of a portrait, and the arresting gaze that this woman has as she looks out at us, and kind of her exquisite adornment, her headdress, as well as her garment that kind of speaks to us across time.
And so three of the most important works, three of the most important portraits in the exhibition are these three, which we borrowed from Yale's Medical Historical Library. And I think it's the first time that they've ever been in an art exhibition. And Winnie Wong writes a really beautiful essay about these works in the catalog, which have often been thought of in terms of clinical representations. So they were painted for Peter Parker, who was an American missionary and physician who worked in Canton and performed many surgeries in the hospital there. And what you're seeing are two patients, two portraits of one man, Po Ashing, and one of Tan Shi. And these are three of more than 80 that Yale has, and more than 100 that are known in the world. But we think that, in fact, there are many, many more portraits by Lamqua of these medical patients, because, as Winnie Wong argues in her essay, what you see is a before and after on the left of this young man, Po Ashing, who was 23 years old when he came to Parker to have this tumor removed, and his arm was amputated. And then you see a portrait of him afterwards, standing in a landscape. This is the only known before and after pair that survives. But documentation suggests that there were many, many other after portraits, and that part of Lamqua's practice was portraying not only the medical condition, but also the healed patient. So one of the questions we have is, sort of what happened to these portraits and how do they relate to the people they represent. It seems possible because because Parker himself was not paying for the portraits for the most part. It seems that someone else is paying for them. Perhaps Lamqua is making them as in thanks, although that seems somewhat unlikely given the volume of the number of portraits. So perhaps the families are commissioning portraits, and these patients were about to undergo a very dangerous and harrowing operation. You can almost see Powashing sort of stoically looking forward before he faces a very risky operation. So in case of their death, the portrait could serve as a representation of a loved family member, and the family may have wanted to have a portrait by Lamqua afterwards. So there may have been some kind of relationship there. But we see in these portraits a real attention to the individuals that are represented, and a sense of them, although they're often portrayed in a very stark space without many, they're not in kind of these grand spaces like Malqua. We get they're represented within this three-dimensional space, looking forward with a real sense of the identity. And I think about that a lot in this portrait of Tanshi, who has probably selected the earring that she wears in order to sit for her portrait. And what's somewhat remarkable is that we know so much about these patients, in part because of the case notes that survive. We know that Tanshi was 48 years old and that she rallied very well. She survived the operation, which is in contrast to this portrait of a beautiful woman of whom we know very little. And we, in fact, don't know whether she's a real person or not. And so this question of what we know and what we can't know is one that runs through the course of the exhibition and the book.
And in kind of conclusion, and in conclusion again, in the exhibition and in our essays in the catalog, we really think about one of the big tensions of the exhibition, which is between the kind of ruthless for-profit operations of this giant corporation and the smaller scale stories of the artists who worked within the orbit of this company and the works of beauty and profundity that they made. One question we had is, in looking at so many artists from so many regions with many different, trained in many different ways, is there a common thread, right? Is there a type of shared visual language that emerges within this market orientation, right? Within a company or a corporate environment? And we think that, yes, in fact, there is a market-oriented aesthetic that emerges and in this period that is, and we see this across the works in the types of works that are made. Here we're looking at three kind of buildings and landscapes that are made by three different artists in three different regions that show kind of how an aesthetic is formulated. In this case, the building's relationship to water, that large sky and its connection to the environment. But we see this over and over again in terms of commercial spaces, commodities, manufactured products, and other types of imagery. And so we just wanted to leave you on, or to conclude at this this first portion of the talk with this attention to artists, and to think about how the artists who are working in the orbit of the East India Company both shape how the company sees and are also shaped by those pressures of a company and the infrastructure that it allows. And part of what we learned from the exhibition and that we hope to share, and we'll also look so forward to your questions and comments, was about the artists, right? How are artists working? How are they learning from one another? How are they experimenting and innovating because of this movement of artists as well as materials around the world? And how do we think about that connection and relationship between art and commerce that creates these kind of extremely innovative and thought-provoking works of art that also make us think about our own day, right? Where we're still in a world that is dominated by corporations and people seeking profit within multiple interconnected markets. So on that, we'll end our first portion of the talk.
Okay. Thank you so much, Laura and Holly, for your wonderful sharing. 感谢两位主讲人的精彩分享。通过两位主讲人的分享呢，我们能够看到这些艺术家、这些商人在东印度公司时期呢，是如何编织出一张全球流动与互动的网络啊。好的，刘老师。
Okay. So, hello, Dr. Pearson and Professor Schaffer. It's great to see you both again. Thank you so much for sharing the impressive exhibition with us. And I'm truly delighted to be part of this discussion and to serve as the translator for our audience. And many thanks well to the Paragon, Mr. Huang and Mr. Zhu for inviting me here. And also I received your catalog from the Paragon here. So I can feel its quality very well. There's something about being able to touch and feel the texture of the physical book, which would never be replaced by the ebook. So after this very brief hello, and as suggested by the Paragon, please allow me to change the channel from English to Chinese because I will provide a very short summary for our audience in China. 所以谢谢 Peterson 博士和 Holly Schaffer 教授的分享。然后呢，我是刘夏玲，也非常感谢家族书局的邀请，还有黄义宏先生在此前非常专业的协助啊。那么非常开心参加这一次的分享，因为这次的这个策展人讲座呢，其实我的角色主要是来辅助大家，那最主要的就是为我们中国的听众提供一些必要的翻译和沟通的一些协助。所以接下来我会先用这个中文把刚刚两位主讲人分享的这个内容呢，就是做一个简短的总结。我的总结呢会分成3个部分，就第一个部分呢就是关于这次展览策展的一个藏品基础，然后第二个就是这个展览的一个核心的结构跟框架，然后第3个部分呢，我会从跨文化艺术史研究的这个角度，然后提出3个关键的问题和视角。那第3个部分呢，由于需要跟2位主讲人沟通，所以在第3个部分的时候，我会再用英文来进行分享。那么这本书首先就是藏品其实是策展的基础，而且藏品体系的建立呢，也不是一朝一夕的事情。所以这个展览在这个耶鲁大学的英国艺术中心，那这个机构呢，它就是在耶鲁大学下属的一间艺术博物馆和研究机构。最早的时候是在1966年，然后是耶鲁的校友，也是慈善家这个 Paul Mellon， 也是很著名的一位赞助人。那他把他很多的藏品就捐赠给了耶鲁大学，然后并且在那个时候就捐资建馆。然后这个建筑呢，也是有非常著名的建筑师路易斯康来设计的，在1977年的时候对外开放。所以到现在的2026年已经是有70年了。所以刚刚诸位呢也可以看到，本次策展人提及的很多的藏品，它的藏品的来源呢都会标注的是 Paul Mellon Foundation， 就这个基金会的一个来源。然后这个英国艺术中心的收藏的特色其实也是跟这个展览很有关系的。那其中他们在亚洲艺术的部分呢，他们在18到19世纪的亚洲艺术收藏的藏品有2000多件，然后他们的主题就主要是来自印度的、中国的，还有是马六甲海峡地区的。所以呢，我们也可以感受得到，就是2位策展人策划的这样一个展览，其实也是对耶鲁英国艺术中心的馆藏进行了一个非常深度的一个挖掘。所以这个是策展的藏品的一个情况。 然后第二个呢，就是关于两位策展人刚刚分享的整个展览的一个框架的脉络，我再非常简要的跟大家一起回顾一下。就是它的这个结构，我们可以看到这个图录这里所显示的，它的图录的结构，包括展览的结构都是非常的清晰，也很值得的学习。那其实这个结构呢，如果我们把它的一些地名标记出来，其实它非常是像一场旅行，也就像刚刚策展人分享的那样，它其实就是标注了一些港口的城市，然后这些画家在这个地方移动，然后也带着他们的眼睛，然后在不同的城市之间游走，然后是邀请我们去进入这样一场旅行。所以它的开篇的部分，我们看到第一章呢，它讲的就是港口的贸易，东方与西方，它是一个在飞机上的俯瞰的视角，先是一个比较宏大的这样的一个视角，然后接下来在第2篇章到第4篇章的时候，就聚焦了在印度的7座城市，然后如果我们把这7间印度的城市呢放在一个地图上的话，它显示出来大概是这样子的，我们就可以看到一条比较清晰的路径。那这条路径呢，它就沿着印度的恒河，然后和这个哥莫蒂河呢，就逐渐的从这个海港和港口的部分深入到印度的内陆地区。然后当然这条路径它背后的一个推动力呢，当然还是东印度公司它版图的一些扩展和他们业务的扩展。但与此同时，随着东印度公司的扩展，那当时的画家他们旅行的脚步和他们的这种记录的脚步也是逐渐的扩展开来。那也所以看到我们今天的这种绘画呈现出来的一些样子。然后在它的第5个篇章呢，它就从印度走向了中国，那他就讨论了是这2个国家之间的一些交流跟互动。然后在最后的一个篇章，那它是聚焦的就是在中国的珠三角地区的2座港口城市，就是广州和澳门。所以这样的一个框架呢，它首先它最有利的一点，或者说它最值得学习的一点，就是它很具体。因为往往我们在谈到一些东西方交流的时候，可能停留在国家层面还是比较多一点，比如说像中法交流啊，中国和荷兰的交流，或者中国与伊朗的这种互动等等的。但是在这里呢，它是把它进一步的具体化、微观化，就是到了一些具体的城市，然后把它的这种具体的人物，然后也纳入到这个框架里面。所以在这样一个我们这里可以看到是这个地方就是从印度到中国，然后在中国的这个部分，它也是有特别的标记几间具体的城市的。那所以就是这样的一个设计呢，它其实就是让很多的画家的眼睛，然后展现出他们的与这种新的主题、新的风格、新的材料和新的技法，然后在这种全球贸易的背景下产生的一些互动和一些相互之间的影响。那这里如果我们把它用一个这样的图表来看一下，首先呢，我们可以看到的是人的流动，然后这里的人呢，他有不同的身份，比如说首先最直观的就是这些绘画的这种画家艺术家，他们是有的是印度籍的，有的是英国的，有的是中国的，然后还有就是其间的一些旅行者，再就是东印度公司的一些官员、商人和职员。然后有的时候这些人的角色呢，他也是会相互交织起来就是有一些重叠的部分。所以这种人的移动，它带来的就是文化的移动跟知识的移动，所以就他们眼睛看到新的生活，就融入了一种新的风格，然后这样一种新的视角呢，也会启发他们的创作。那同时除了在艺术的层次上呢，他们也去塑造了一些新的定制的需求，新的消费的需求等等，这个就跟这个公司的部分是有关的。 然后当然在这个下方我们看到，伴随着人的移动，其实它有更多的元素是一起的，或者说它是由于人的移动被激发出来的。那么一方面呢是这些移动的物件，比如说一些绘画，然后瓷器、漆器、丝绸、银器等等，还有就是对于一些动物跟植物的一些知识的流动，还有就是关于一些医药跟医学的流动。然后它被提炼出来呢，就是风格、技术、材料等等这些，在一个全球语境之下的一种互动了。所以这样的一个图景，其实也是两位策展人在本次的展览中想要去呈现的这样一个交流的图景。然后接下来呢，就为了之后的这个讨论呢，我会来分享3个在跨文化艺术史里面的研究视角。当然为了主讲人的理解呢，我会用英文来进行分享，然后最后也同样会用中文来做一个简短的总结。So next I will share 3 perspectives regarding the transcultural art history for our discussion. And so I will give very brief proposal. The first, very interesting topic is exhibition focused on the individual and a first-person perspective. So now here I would like to mention another exhibition for the reference, which is called the Canton Trade, Botanic, Paintings and Cultural Exchange. And in the 18th century to 19th century, the Guangzhou Maritime Museum. So this exhibition grew out of Professor Chen Meibao, came from the City University of Hong Kong. And this book named Encountering Huangdong. So this exhibition and the book focuses on a small figure named Huangdong, and who was active in Guangzhou 13 factories between 1767 and 1796. So through his daily life, the travel journeys and friendships, particularly his connection with the British merchant and plant expert, the John Blake, the exhibition presents a micro historical portrait of the time from the Huangdong's perspective. And for example, here is an illustration from a Chinese-English dictionary compiled by the 18th century British botanist John Blake. So it shows a British person in China actively engaged in learning and collecting the new knowledge of China. So this is quite interesting because just like the Yale exhibition, it focuses on the same period, 18th century to 19th century. And in this time, we could say that how the Chinese viewed British and how the British viewed Chinese, and as well as how the painters, the English painters viewed India. So these different perspectives together reveal a multiple layered pathway of cultural and intellectual exchange at that time. And both of the exhibition came from the perspective of an individual and the very specific people. So I think it's very interesting and also is a way deserve to learn. And the second I would like to mention is the role of India. So, and I believe we all very familiar with the East India companies, such like the British, the French, and the Dutch East India companies. But however, what exactly happened in India at that time? So the transit hub of that time is less widely known. So what were the local effects of the Eastern objects arriving there? This exhibition and its catalogue helping us develop deeper into what was happening on the ground in India during that time. And so here, this is a print depicted the fort of St. George on the Coromandel coast, belonging to the East India Company of England, 18th century. And why I mention this painting is because let me also mention the Coromandel lacquer screen, which is the subject of my doctoral dissertation and also my personal great passion as well. So they have been used as the interior decoration in Europe. For example, this is just example, but there are more examples in Europe. And this kind of Chinese lacquer screen named Quantai in China. But however, it has been called the Commando lacquer screen in Europe for 100 years. And the term Commando, means the name of east and south coast of India. So this is a very interesting example of the exchange between India and China, and also reflects the very interesting connections between the India coast and China in the global trade. So this chapter in India is highly significant. Before the Eastern objects reached Europe, what exactly happened to them at the transit points, such as the India ports, and what specific impacts did they have on the regions along the way? So the Yale exhibition here and this catalogue provide a perfect example and give us an answer. And we could know what happened in India during the 18th century and 19th century. So it's a very important view. And the third, the exchanges within the Pearl River part and China and Asia. So this exhibition concludes in Guangzhou and Macau. And regarding the famous painting of Tinggua's studio, there have been many studies in academia for this painting, as well as the different versions. For example, the English version and another one have the Chinese titled version, but they are almost identical. And according to another, and systematically compiled the series of paintings and identified 13 nearly identical versions until the end of his life in Macau. So during this period, he traveled back and forth between Macau and Guangzhou a lot. So he has a life between the East and West. And the Tinghua in Guangzhou and Mr. Chenery in Macau also reflects the exchanges of the Pearl River. So these two, and the Lingua learned the oil painting following Mr. Chenery. So these two people, they based in Macau and Guangzhou. So this is very interesting, and also I would like to invite you to have a look of 18th century lacquer screen. This screen is housed in the Oriental Museum in Lisbon. On one side, decorated in black lacquer with gold painting, depicts the map of Guangzhou, and the other side, with the red lacquer with gold painting, depicts the map of Macau. So this echoes the interaction between Guangzhou and Macau at that time. And during this period, and more detailed and more concrete exchanges between the different cities and painters in the Pearl River region is also a subject well worth further exploration. And the curator's attention to China's pause at the end of the exhibition, after the pause in India, serves as a mirror, so reflecting with the earlier discussion of the exchange in the India part. So I do think this is a very interesting curation work and a very great work. So for these three aspects, I personally find interesting, and I think which should deserve more research. Okay, so we can have a look at the detail. This is the Guangzhou, and this is Macau. Sorry, a little bit mistake here. So this is the three parts. I would like to borrow your brain for these three perspectives. 然后我最后就是比较简单的就是回顾一下这三个，就是在现在的东西方交流跟跨文化的研究之中呢，我个人觉得有三个方面可能需要更多的研究，也刚好是这个展览提供了一个很好的例子。就第一个就是关注个体的，然后这种从第一视角出发的一些研究跟策展。 然后特别是从一些微观视角出发的，像那个刚才的程美宝教授的专注衍生出来的《遇见黄东》的这个展览呢，它也是跟耶鲁的这个展览是聚焦同一个时段，都是18世纪到19世纪的，但是它聚焦的是一位中国人，在广州，然后他跟在广州的英国人的交往，以及他又前往到英国，然后在英国的各种见闻。所以这个关于黄东的展览跟这个2位策展人在耶鲁的这个关于画家们在印度的这种绘画的展览就特和对人的关注的研究其实也是可以有更多的探索。然后第二个就是关于印度的角色，关于这个印度的角色呢，其实像这本书，它有非常具体的一些讨论，聚焦到一些我们都不太特别为人熟知的一些印度的城市。那其实印度它作为在全球贸易中一个非常重要的中转站，其实它的作用也是很大的，但是相对来说它的研究呢是比较少的。那举一个小小的例子，像这一幅版画呢，它呈现出来的是18世纪的英国东印度公司的圣乔治堡，在印度的这个科罗曼多海岸的。那科罗曼多这个地方，它会也是非常有趣的一个地点，就是像我们这里看到的这一类的中国的漆屏风，他们是在中国制作的，他们在中国的名字是款彩屏风，但是他们到欧洲呢，法国人就给他们命名是科罗曼多漆屏风。那科罗曼多就是印度海岸的一个名字。那这样的一种命名的方式，已经持续了几百年，就直到现在的西方学界也都是用印度的这个港口的名字来命名这一类来自中国的屏风的。所以其实像在18世纪的时候的印度，中国的和东方的物品在那边中转的时候，他们发生了什么？比如说他们是否有一些交互，或者对当地产生的一些影响等等，像这些研究目前都还没有看到一些比较深入的一些挖掘。所以这个也是说这一本书它带来了很多关于印度地区的这种跨文化交流的视角，尤其是把东印度公司他们真正的一些活动的轨迹进一步的具体化，那对于学术研究来说也是非常重要的一环。然后第三个呢，就是关于中国和亚洲内部的一个互动的问题。其实这个也是在海外的时候，许多老师都会关注跟提及的问题。因为我们现在也做了很多的研究，都是聚焦在东方跟西方的一个交流的互动。我们会讨论很多图式的流外销艺术的流动、物品的流动，但是在中国内部。其实像中国、日本、韩国，甚至我们更具体化的话，就是在珠三角地区这种澳门、广州，他们那个时候的一些知识、一些人的一些流动等等，就这些研究还是不够的。就是这种更加聚焦的一些个案的研究，应该还是会比较需要。那所以所以这也是这2位策展人的这一本书呢，也是提供给我们的一个视角，就他们也有关注到，就是澳门跟广州，还有就是一些具体的城市之间的这样一些交流。然后这里也是提到这一幅画，那他们的也都有一组的这样的绘画。然后最后的话就是，这2位林瓜他是跟钱纳利先生是学油画的。那像那个时候他们之间是有非常频繁的一些往来。那包括像这一扇18世纪的漆屏风呢，它也是一面是画澳门，一面是画广州，所以这说明当时的这几间城市之间的一种知识和一种比如说这种地图等等的这种技法的流动是非常密切的，但是好像目前也没有足够的研究来去探讨这一批的物品，包括还有澳门在一个东西方交流中的位置，其实也是特别需要被继续探索的一个部分。所以这个就是提供3个视角，供这个讨论。然后一会儿黄先生呢也发了几个问题，我想我应该会在2位策展人回应之后呢，就是来问一下我们的策展人。Okay, so Laura and Holly, I just finished. Sorry, So
should we respond first to your wonderful questions or comments?
yeah, please. I think please feel free to share any thoughts.
Yes. So, first of all, thank you. This was such a rich response, and we're grateful to you for sharing these ideas with us, and connecting it to your own research, which is completely fascinating. And we're really looking forward to reading more. I think that to the first question, the movement of people and this idea of the first person perspective, and it was thank you for bringing the other wonderful exhibition into dialogue with this one. And this was one of our goals was, and this is, I think the tension that everyone sees within this period is that you have these very powerful kind of macro large scale forces, right? A giant corporation, which is really hard to imagine. And then we have these smaller scale stories. And we definitely tried to bring both. So the first and last room of the exhibition are global, and then we really hone in on specific individuals. And we did try to bring out the stories of specific people. So like, for example, we spoke about Jairam Das and Charles Doyley, as well as the Impis, Mir Chand and Tilly Kettle, Gangaram Tambat and James, I didn't actually mention his name, and his connection to the Scottish artist James Wales. And then, of course, Chinnery and Lamqua. And I think this was also part of our motivation is also how do we know about people in the past? How do we know about artists? How do we think about their stories? And this is also where we were so invested in the story of conservation, which was such a key part for us.
Because I think one of the things, there are many artists in the show whose names are now unknown. They certainly, those individuals were known at one time, but they may have been part of a workshop that was never intended to be kind of linked to an individual person. But that in and of itself is a story. And so by thinking about the techniques, for me, I think it for that work that I talked about, the babbler on a branch, by looking and exploring those materials, I was able to imagine that work coming into being. And for me, that brought me closer to this artist who I know, whose identity I don't know, but I know about how he was applying paint and how he was sort of thinking through the work. And so that first person perspective, especially when you're dealing with this big massive corporation, to find those moments of kind of wonder and awe within the individual stories.
Yeah, and just to echo and what Laurel's saying, when we don't know the names of artists, we can still learn a lot about them. And I think it was kind of a revelation of the show was how productive it can be to work and think through conservation, especially when there are so many, unrecorded artists. And we want to stress the unrecorded. Now we don't know as much about the artists, but surely in the time we could have known more about them. So it's also kind of just to gesture to the fact that archives and records reference some people, but not others. And so how do we as historians and curators bring out people and voices and hands from the past if they're not recorded in text, right? And of course, that's like why we're art historians and why we all love art so much. But I think it is really a powerful aspect is that in fact, so much does remain in these gorgeous works of art. How can we interpret them also through people and through this first person perspective, as you so nicely framed it?
And there is also the possibility that their identities will be uncovered. To the two works by Jairam Das, Holly was able to identify they had previously been unknown. So it's in putting the work out forward, we hope that more of those individual stories emerge.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the feedback. And I think also bringing the unknown artist is also very meaningful for this exchange. Yeah.
And then to your wonderful question about the role of India, and as we were working on this, and again, because and this also actually taps into one of the questions we noticed in the chat, because we're focused primarily on the British East India Company. It's one of other companies, but because the British East India Company really gained territorial control of parts of India, many of the works in the YCB's collections connect to India. But we were quite committed in the exhibition to tell the story across Asia. And this is where it's, and especially between India and China, again, through that Malacca Strait region. And this is also connected to what the East Indies is. And in the period, the East Indies was understood as essentially everything between the Strait of Magellan in South America to the Cape of Good Hope in South, at the southern tip of Africa, which is essentially everything but the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a really vast amount of the world, and it also connects the Americas and Asia and Africa. And it kind of just doesn't include Europe, and it doesn't include that part of America. So it's really vast, but it does highlight this word India in it, and the area of South Asia which we focus on, and its connections to, again, Southeast and East Asia, really comes out because of that territorial acquisition. And how does that happen? It's that the East India Company, the British East India Company, is able to gain more trading privileges in India than it can in other parts of the world. Now, in Southeast Asia, that's because the Dutch East India Company has taken control of many parts of Southeast Asia. And so the British East India Company keeps trying to gain control in what is now, Malaysia and Indonesia. But they only gain very short-lived strongholds there. But we do have we have works from Malacca in particular in the exhibition, where many Chinese artists were working. And we do think that what was known as the breadfruit in the period was likely made by Chinese artists. And there are also Chinese artists working in India in this period as well. That's where I'll start.
Yeah, and I would just also, one of the sort of fascinating things when, especially earlier in the 18th century, when looking at records about goods that are coming from Asia into Britain, is often they're referred to as Indian, even when they're coming from China. And that's because they're on East India Company ships. So so they'll talk about Indian wallpaper, which is actually wallpaper that's made in China. But because it's come on an East India Company boat, it gets this name. So there's a real kind of, there's a little bit of confusion given the great distance. Of course, during this period, it took many months to travel from Europe to Asia. So there's sort of a game of telephone, or like there can be things confused.
And this actually leads into your wonderful research on those amazing screens, because we do see these conflations, right, between regions. And when I saw the screens that you just showed, I immediately thought of this series of tapestries that were made in England for Elihu Yale. Now, Elihu Yale, after whom Yale University is named, Elihu Yale was an East India Company merchant, and he became the governor of Madras, now Chennai, on the Coromandel coast. And it's and that's how he made his money, right? He made his money in trade, especially in textiles and diamonds.
In an earlier
period. So it's about 100 years before, or not quite, it's 75 years or so before we really focus on in the exhibition. But it is a very important moment. And the textiles that I'm thinking of, four of which are in the Yale University Art Gallery, at least one of which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they are mimicking the japanned technique, but in textile form. And they have a border, or at least the ones at Yale have a border, at the Yale University Art Gallery have a border of commodities, of fruits, vegetables, animals, all of the plants and animals that are moving between kind of across the so-called East Indies. And then in the main part of the tapestry, you see scenes from the Americas, from India or South Asia, and from China. And so you see all of this. You see how there are, and there was a recent book published called Amerasia, right? You see how in the period, this idea of the East Indies kind of conflated different regions, traditions, subjects into this kind of nebulous form of the East Indies. And you see this across artistic traditions. But many artists also played on that. And I think one of the great examples in India, at least, is the production of textiles, such as chintzes. And we included one very beautiful hand-painted chintz, which is a hand-painted cotton textile in the show. And these works and the artists who made them, they really changed the designs based on where they were going, and often brought multiple designs together. And so artists are very savvy, right? And there are some chintzes, and actually the one in our exhibition, which is also why it was so arresting to us and paired so well with the yellow-eyed babbler, was that it really does draw on kind of Indian traditions of kind of animated nature, very vibrant kind of design-oriented depiction of the natural world, with their ideas of Chinese plants and design, as well as European ones. And they do circulate a lot of these kind of styles, images, associations, kind of move between worlds in these kind of really fascinating ways on these networks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing the other examples, the other materials. It's a very, very interesting circulation in that part